Right. So my name is Vincent Peck.
My
Hi,
name is
I'm
Travis
Hannah
Brant.
Hardy.
Okay. I'm Travis Branson.
I'm Hannah Hardy.
I'm Christy Johnson.
And I'm Sierra Williams.
All right. And so this is our group case study presentation based upon data analysis. And so we're going to start with step one. So we were analyzing actually a math exam that was given by Mrs. Esperanza for an Algebra 1 class. So step one is asking us what parts of this data caught our attention. So I could see that the students were struggling with short answer and open-ended questions. Specifically, the students are having problems with explaining or expressing themselves on systems of equations through graphing, writing linear equations, solving linear equations, writing and solving linear equations and open-ended questions, solving system of equations in short answer, answering short answer questions that involve graphing, parallel and perpendicular lines in linear equations, and also writing and solving linear equations in open-ended questions.
The first thing I saw when I looked at this data was honestly all the red. I saw a lot of red, and so that made me want to look into it and read a little further and see what was all the red. And like Vincent said, most of it, when you get down into the bottom part of the data, was due to the open-ended questions, and solving the systems of equations was the pretty big struggle of the class on this assessment.
I also noticed all the red in the data and how low the overall percentages were correct per question for the students. And just wondering, what was the struggle for the students, why the percentages were so low.
And I noticed that students, they did have an understanding of the material based off of the 86% of the students answered correctly on solving linear equations. What was very apparent, though, is that the students could not relay that knowledge to the open-ended and short answer questions. For the short answer, students only answered correctly 50% of the time and only 48% of the time for open-ended questions. So there was a pretty big margin there between the multiple choice and then the open-ended and the short answer.
And I agree with y'all as far as especially the open-ended questions, those stuck out to me as well, with only 3 of the 14 kids being able to answer those. And then only 60% scored, only 7 of 14 score over 60%. So again, those open-ended and those short answer questions, how poorly the kids did on those really, really stuck out above the rest, and as well as low performance in the Algebra 1 Standard 2.
Right. And so for me to just wrap this up, in comparison to the multiple choice questions as opposed to the open-ended and short answer questions, so there's really no thought processes going on with multiple choice. It's really multiple guess. So there's really no application of it. You either, guess correctly or not. So step two, well, okay, so we have this graph, the pre-algebra standards, and these are the different targeted objectives, learning objectives. So data analysis, scatter plots, 30.6%. Mean, median, and mode was 26.5% of the pre-algebra standards. Percents was 16.8%, and number sets properties was 26.1%. So a large portion of pre-algebra standards was related to data analysis and scatter plots, and a smaller percentage was dedicated to percents.
I think it's important to show that, because when I look at just any data in general and I see a lot of red like in this one, I like to look back and see like what prerequisites could have maybe had some play into what happened with the assessment that we're looking at currently. And so I think that's really important to look at the pre-algebra standards to see what, because in math we know that everything builds on each other. So if the students are struggling with what they're learning now in Algebra 1, it's a pretty good chance that we could go back and reteach some of those pre-algebra standards to help out with that. So I think that's important. I think we're ready for step 2.
Okay, step 2. What does the data tell us and what does the data not tell us? All right, so for me, what the data is telling us is that from a knowledge standpoint, the students are able to answer multiple choice questions about writing linear equations and solving linear equations. Now, what the data does not tell us is actually how the teacher taught those lessons and how she checked for the students' understanding. The data does not tell us whether the students have been exposed to evaluating linear expressions, and there are some pre-algebra standards that have not been mastered. Why? I'm not sure.
The data tells us that half of the students, 50%, scored 60% or higher on the assessment, and 43% of the students scored 65% or higher on the assessment.
I see when I look at the data that, as we mentioned just a while ago, that all of the red, the first thing I see is that these need to be retaught. As I mentioned, the math's growing on each other. Before Miss Esperanza goes on to her next lesson, I think she needs to reteach some things to clear up some misconceptions in order to help the students be successful in the following lessons. So that's what the data shows me, that we need to go back and reteach to help the students learn further for the next lesson.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, the data tells us that the students have been taught the content, but the students need to be taught to think more abstractly. For example, open-ended questions often require some imagination. Students are being taught the material, but there needs to be some modifications of the approach to teaching the material.
Right, and like it tells us that students do need some remediation, like you guys said and touched on. Like you said, Hannah, it builds on top of in math, things build on top of the next. So if you don't have a great understanding of the things you learned prior to, it's kind of hard to understand those next steps. But some of the things it didn't tell us, if there are any learning disorders with the kids, any language barriers, maybe kids were absent a lot, and showed up that day for the test, and so they didn't have proper, reps at getting this done. And we also don't know if they were pretest scores, because maybe if they did pretest, maybe this is growth and they were just that far behind. So that's kind of why.
Right.
That's a really great point.
Very good points. Yeah.
So when I'm looking at step 2, and what I'm hearing you guys say is that the teacher probably covered a lot of material, so that's width, but not necessarily depth. So I like to use the analogy of planting seeds. So you're out here, you're planting this garden, and you got so many rows, but actually you're supposed to plant those seeds a certain depth, for optimal growth. So if I was a farmer and I'm looking at how she taught the lesson, she probably, taught this deep, where she should have probably went that deep. So just a little more time, and especially exposing them to different ways to express or evaluate linear equations would be a good step in the right direction to not only help them understand and apply what they've learned, but to apply it to other situations as well. The next step is step 3. So we know we have some problems or some potential problems with the data. So what are some good news that we're here to celebrate? So we're going to start with Christy.
Well, 100% of the class mastered identifying functions on the test. So
Woohoo!
that's good.
That is good. And so good news I want to celebrate is 71% mastery of SAT easy questions. So when we're looking at probably proficiency, we're looking at 80% and above. I look at that 71%, I'm saying, hey, this is a quick and easy fix.
Mhm. That's a good point. Yeah, you can grow, you can get to that 80% quicker. 89% mastered solving linear equations and 82% mastered data analysis and scatter plots. So there's a lot of good news on the data. And as Sierra was mentioning earlier, we don't know which, like this could all be a lot of really, there could be good news that we don't know about. This could be really good news. These kiddos could have grown exponentially and we just don't know it because we only have one piece of data. So I think there
Right.
was a lot of good, even though there's a lot of red, there's a lot of good to look at.
Yeah. Again, the students have a pretty strong base of the knowledge required to increase the scores in every area. And to kind of piggyback on what Sierra was talking about is you don't know what I teach at a Title I school and I also teach special ed as well. And we have a lot of underprivileged kids, and you don't know their background as far as where they're coming from, and so that's not indicated on this chart. And so Miss Esperanza might be doing a pretty good job, and we just don't know it.
I put students perform well on multiple choice questions. I know earlier events, you spoke about multiple guess, and sometimes that is, you made a lucky guess, and then in some cases, kids can actually process. All right, I know it's not this, I know it's not that. So, what's better out of these two? So that is a testing technique. So maybe they have mastered that part, as well as mastering the standard one of the algebra one. So.
Now, I know that we've discussed a lot in previous data meetings, uh, being able to measure what it is, think about what it is you want to measure and how you want to measure it. So here are some of the problems suggested by this data. So additional teaching of pre-algebra standards that have not been mastered, especially using the RTI approach. Special emphasis should be placed on percents and evaluating linear expressions and equations. Notice I put emphasis on evaluating linear expressions and equations because that is what they were pretty much weak in across the board as far as open-ended and short-ended question, or short answer question, should I say. And also, each of these must be aligned to assure that the teacher is on target to meet her class, district, and state goals.
The student scores on the Algebra 1 number 2 standards are the lowest of all three of the standards being taught, so the standards need to be revisited, and she needs to find a new approach for the instruction for the class to be considered.
Problem of practice I noticed was, like y'all have mentioned, the open-ended questions. And from an elementary teacher standpoint, I teach first grade. And so a lot of our tests, and even from special ed, I know you can do, there's a lot of accommodations for like my kiddos. If I need to test their knowledge, I can ask them in multiple ways. So it counts if they can just tell me, or if they can draw me a picture, or if they can, give it in multiple ways. But in high school, you can't really do that. And a lot of the knowledge that you learn in high school is how to take a test taking skills. And so I think that going back and doing a little bit of instruction on what does it look like to give an open-ended answer? What do you need to do? How can you read this? How can you dissect it? How can you figure out what the question is really asking? Because a lot of those questions have a lot of fluff in there to try to trick you. So going back and trying to figure out and learn, get a basis for some of those test taking skills would be helpful. And a problem of practice that could be helped out to improve the scores.
Yeah, again, the open-ended questions and the short answer were a problem. So exemplars can be used to provide clear and concise explanations of abstract or complex concepts. They make the concepts more tangible. That's something that she could use, and in order to increase the scores. But that's something that the data shows is lacking.
I mentioned earlier about the pretest. We don't know if they've grown, but one thing she may be able to do is give more practice assessments that kind of not necessarily the same questions, but similar questions to what's going to be on the main test. Where the kids get more practice at it, and I put remediate on the domains under each standard where students perform less than 60%, as well as maybe doing some small group tutoring sessions or kind of grouping the kids, mix them up based on the kids that have mastered, the kids that need a little more guidance and help. And as I saw where, we talked about collaboration earlier, sometimes those kids that have it can help the kids that don't when you put them in smaller groups. And then maybe adjust time you spend on each standard. If they got it, like you said, I'm sorry, Hannah, about you, some way, a way they can show you they've mastered it or understand as you ask them, or they tell you, or they draw a picture. So if it's an easier standard or something they've shown that they pretty much have, kind of just move on from that and then spend more time on the standards that they struggle with. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, Vincent, with the maybe you have to go deeper, in how you plant that seed. So
And sometimes it can be as easy as having them to break down the steps to explain what it is they're doing, show how they're setting up the problem, and then solving it. I know for
Mhm.
me, I can troubleshoot if I can see your thought process, to see
Right.
what it is you're trying to
Mhm.
do. I think one other thing that I might have overlooked earlier was when I was looking at the pre-algebra standards, they did have something listed about linear expressions, but it was blank. It didn't have any scores beside it. So I'm not sure if Miss Esperanza got a chance to teach that, or if that was something that was even introduced during this grading period. If not, then that would definitely explain why there's a deficiency with open-ended and short answer questions as it pertains to solving equations, specifically linear equations. Does anyone have anything else they would like to add? Okay, well, if not, I think this has been a very productive um, data meeting. We're going to take this information and go to the drawing board, see if we can develop some plans and interventions to help Ms. Esperanza with her class. Uh,
We got one more step.
Got one more step?
I think
Okay.
it's under that, go down one more, Vince.
Yeah.
There you go.
So step 5, thank you guys. So this says, what are your key conclusions and what recommendations does the team have for addressing the problem of practice?
The open-ended and short answer questions were, as we know, a problem. Solving and graphing linear equations is a deficit across the board. In order to address these deficiencies, it is important to address these specific challenges that students are facing with short answer and open-ended questions related to linear equations and systems of equations. Below, I'll put some examples that we could use in order to address this problem that Ms. Esperanza could use, or any of us could use. Visual aids. We start by reinforcing the concept of linear equations, which encourages students to plot equations on coordinate grids to visualize the relationship between variables. Also, step-by-step problem solving, which will break down the complex problems into smaller steps, and it has students break down the steps in practice and repetition is the next step. Assign regular practice problems that involve writing, solving, and graphing linear equations. And then one that I like to use a lot of is peer collaboration and discussion, which encourages students to work together in small pairs or small groups to solve problems. Peers teaching each other is really effective. And we also like to differentiate at our school and get kids in the right situations with the right level, that they're make sure they're learning at the right level at the right pace.
One recommendation I would do if I was with Miss Esperanza in person is I would go to her and talk to her about like everything we've been discussing about how you can't really see deep into her classroom by just looking at a piece of paper. So I would definitely like talk to her and see what maybe things are happening that we could address that aren't on the paper, and then see how that correlates into it. Obviously, we've talked about revisiting the material, going back and reteaching, but if we don't figure out a way of what we're going to reteach, then that's going to be ineffective. So figuring out, like Sierra mentioned, the kiddos that are bringing things with them, like maybe they didn't have a good breakfast, maybe there's all those outside factors that could play into that. And then also the not emotional part, but just the academic part of revisiting that to see what you could improve on. So I'd definitely like go to her and talk to her and see how we could work together on that as the data coach. If this was in person, that would be my first thing to do.
And if it is decided that the materials are represented, if they're presented in a different variety of ways, like from multiple perspectives, including videos, text, demonstrations, and additional resources used to achieve mastery, she could use those in her classroom to help with the students to achieve their goals.
You guys had some great points. I'm big on the pre-test sparks. I feel like that kind of gives you, if you pre-test them and you kind of see where they are, it gives you a better idea of what you need to spend more time on, and what you may have to have those, additional visual aids or additional resources or things to show them to help them master those standards they're struggling with. So that's where I am with just pre-test, do benchmarks so you can continue to see the growth in the kids.
All right, thank you guys. That concludes our meeting.
Thank you.